Welcome to the Sober and Happy podcast, where we talk about all things recovery related, how to navigate the challenges that we'll face along the way on our journey towards our best lives, and how we could go from living a life of simply just being sober to a life where we're both sober and happy. If you've been in the recovery world for any amount of time, you've likely heard the term dry drunk. This term is thrown around often, but I don't think it is fully understood. I know I didn't understand it when I first got sober. I just knew from the way everybody talked about it that I should try not to become one. But what does it mean to be a dry drunk? How do we recognize the behaviors of it, and how does that affect our recovery? Well, that is what we're going to be talking about today. So buckle up. This is going to be a great episode. Welcome back. I do the same intro every week for this podcast where I talk about how we could go from living a life of simply just being sober to a life where we're both sober and happy. But what does just being sober mean? It could have many different personal meanings to someone. It could be someone who is white-knuckling it through sobriety one day at a time and nothing seems to be getting better. It could be someone who may not be thinking about drinking anymore but is not happy with their life. It could be someone who is sober, living a decent life, but knows they are destined for something even greater, but seems stuck where they are at and unable to make that next step they desperately want to make in their life. I know for me, I think back to a point in my life when I was 5 years sober. I'd been heavily involved in AA at that point for all of my sobriety. The pink cloud had worn off many years ago. I'd done everything I was told to with the promise of being happy, joyous, and free, but I felt none of that. At that point, I was still sober, but I was back to looking for outside things to make me feel right on the inside. I was eating crappy food, spending money that I didn't have on things that I thought would make me happy, constantly needing acceptance and attention from others to feel good, and trying to date to fill a hole that had grown inside of me. I remember the night I got my 5-year chip. In the home group I had at that time, birthday night was a huge event. We dressed up, family members came to the meeting, and one by one, each person's sponsor would present your chip to you in front of the whole group, say some nice things about you, and then you would say a few things about how amazing it is to be sober to inspire and give hope to the newcomers in the room. I loved birthday night. This was my 5-year chip, and I knew that it was a huge milestone. I should be happy and proud of myself at that moment. I listened to my sponsor say a lot of amazing things about me. He handed me my chip, and then it was my turn to talk. I said all the right things, spread a little hope around the room, and smiled as everyone clapped and congratulated me on my big milestone. Then I sat down and realized I was the most miserable I've ever been sober. I wouldn't have considered myself a dry drunk at that moment because I'd always heard that term thrown around about people when they're being irritable, and I was, for the most part, still putting on a happy face around other people. But at that meeting, I happened to sit next to what is often referred to as a grumpy old-timer, which usually is just a dry drunk with a lot of sober time. As each person got their chip, he seemed to have something negative to say. Her sober time doesn't count because I know she smokes weed. I doubt that guy makes it another 30 days because he isn't willing to do his 4-step. Look at that guy in the back room texting. He needs to get off his phone and pay attention to the meeting. My first thought was, man, I hope I never end up like this guy. But then I realized, although I might not have had the same exact complaints or judgments that this guy did, I was just as miserable as he was. The only difference is he said what he felt out loud, and I was hiding how I felt in an attempt to live up to an identity I've created for myself of living the sober dream. We were both dry drunks. I just hid it better at that moment. Now, I will admit, I didn't always hide it well. You could talk to some of my sponsees at the time, and I often showed my irritability with them when they didn't follow the directions of the big book, but I always justified that as tough love. But it wasn't. I was simply miserable and taking it out on the people closest to me. So how did this happen? How did I go from someone riding the pink cloud of early sobriety, absolutely grateful just to be sober, to finding myself on the fast track to becoming a grumpy old-timer? There were a couple of components that were key for me. The most glaring is that I was living a lie. I had known for a few years that the program of Alcoholics Anonymous did not align with my beliefs and values. But if you heard me talk at a meeting, I was good at talking about the great life that Alcoholics Anonymous had given me. And on the outside, there was no reason to doubt what I was saying. But on the inside, I was miserable. My motivation to do that also contributed to how I felt. I received a lot of praise from the people in AA. This felt great at first. When you're a worthless drunk for so many years, having someone tell you that you're doing great things feels really good. But I still didn't know how to love myself, and honestly, I'm still working on that today. But at that point, the only time I felt worthy was when other people gave me positive attention. And at that point in my life, I confused attention for love. And for a while, that attention I was getting in AA was filling that void that was inside of me. But the biggest contributing factor was that I had not addressed the deeper issues that led me to my addiction in the first place. Yes, I worked my steps, which included listing out many of those things and sharing them with a sponsor, but I never did the deep work to truly heal from them. I was the same hurt, angry, sad, and confused person. I just hadn't had a drink in 5 years. I was a dry drunk. Many of us are going to hit this stage in our sobriety, sometimes even multiple times. With each person, it is going to manifest in different ways, but I think there are some universal warning signs that we could look out for. The most obvious is emotional instability. This could appear as angry outbursts, or like my example, going through all the negative emotions with an outburst, but just stuffing it down inside. Usually, when we are in this stage, much of our attitude and thoughts are negative. It is really easy to get stuck in stages of pessimism, self-pity, and a sense of victimhood. The quickest way I found to test this is to spend a few minutes scrolling Facebook. If I find myself judging every post and wanting to comment to tell people how wrong they are, that is a huge red flag for me. The next warning sign is isolation. It is very common to start to pull away from not only people as we enter this stage, but we often will also stop doing many of the things that we once enjoyed doing. I also keep an eye out for how much I'm judging and trying to control others. I think much of the symptoms of being a dry drunk come from a feeling of a lack of control in our own lives, and it's very common to begin to try to control others when our lives feel out of control. For me, this manifested in how I was treating my sponsees at the time, but you might see this pop up in many relationships in your life. The last one is having a lack of accountability. This can come in many forms, but the two most common are not taking accountability for the effects of our actions on others and blaming outside circumstances and other people for everything wrong with our lives. Now, we know that recognizing the problem is only the first step. So if we're showing symptoms of being a dry drunk, how do we fix it? The first step is acceptance. Accept where you are in your recovery journey as not the destination of what sobriety looks like, but as a stepping stone to a better life on the other side of this struggle. Now, this isn't an excuse to justify your actions, but instead an invitation to accept that you are a perfectly imperfect human being and that you are going to struggle in the process of your healing and growth. I heard a gentleman named Matthew Hussey say something on a podcast earlier today that hit home for me. He said, "You don't have to like your actions to still love yourself." When we often do things that we consider bad, we often label ourselves as a bad person. We're going to do things that hurt ourselves and others. The key is, instead of justifying and excusing them, recognizing and working to change them. So if you're working through this process, remember to not only be gentle on yourself, but also don't forget to congratulate yourself for the effort you are making to change and improve your life. The next step is to commit to becoming accountable for our actions and our lives. This does not mean that we're going to be in control of all aspects of our lives, because life is still going to happen. People we love are going to die. People we trust are going to betray us. Relationships that we think are going to last forever are going to end. And random bad things are going to happen on a day right after we ask ourselves, what else could go wrong today? We have no control over the randomness of life, but we do have control over how we react to them. I could list all the reasons I have given why I drank the way I did and why all my previous attempts to get sober didn't work, but I don't have to, because there was a common thing for each one, and that was because of what they did. The theys in that statement included people past and present in my life, companies that fired me, and society as a whole. Most of the time, I was not taking accountability for how I was reacting to the things that happened. Let's say we drink as a reaction to something bad happening in our lives. The thing that happened may be something that we had no control over, but we have to take accountability for the choice to take a drink, even when we feel like we have no other choice but to take a drink. At this point, I want to circle back to the previous step of being gentle with yourself. We are not taking accountability for the purpose of blaming or beating up on ourselves. We are doing it for two key reasons here. The first is when we decide to take accountability for our actions, we are now taking the power back. When we blame people, places, and things for how we act, we are turning over all of our power to outside forces. And most importantly, the second we do that and we make the choice to react differently, we begin to learn that we are not powerless. We are capable of making the right choice no matter how hard it seems. I decided to try therapy. All the things I had spent years stuffing down were finally surfacing, and I had no idea how to handle them. I realized that sometimes the best way to become accountable is to admit that we need help. I learned that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done. Facing my fears and insecurities was a sign of massive strength. It was the best decision I've made in my sobriety. It gave me a different perspective on many of the events I'd blamed other people for. More importantly, we started digging into the deeper reasons that drove me to my addictions in the first place, and the many things that were completely out of my control. Sometimes bad things that we have no control over, did nothing to deserve, and had no way to prevent them happen to us. Many of us were not taught how to handle these things in a healthy way. That is not our fault. What we do have the power over, though, is accepting the challenge to finally heal from our past and to learn healthy coping mechanisms to deal with the certain challenges that we'll face in the future. Something magical starts to happen when we decide to do that. When we start taking responsibility for the things in our control, we also stop blaming ourselves for the things that were out of our control. When we begin to heal the wounds that often have made us feel unworthy of good things happening to us, we begin to feel worthy of a better life. Our imagination of all the amazing things that are possible in the future becomes activated again. And when we begin to feel worthy, we open ourselves up to the potential that we all possess. We begin to trust our intuition again. We start to tap into the power that we had all along to face challenging situations that we lost touch with years ago. You see, being a dry drunk has nothing to do with quitting drinking. It is a state of frustration we feel when we are unable to see a brighter future. It is the feeling of being stuck in a place that we hate. It is when the only options we are able to see is being sober and miserable or going back to being drunk and miserable. That day I was sitting in the birthday meeting, that is exactly how I felt. I should have been celebrating my 5-year milestone, but I knew I was in a place that I didn't belong and I was staying there for all the wrong reasons. I'd tried something that I was certain was going to work, but was not willing to try anything else. I'd already tried every outside way I knew to try to feel better inside, and it was only making me feel worse. So how did I go from being a dry drunk to the life I live today? Willingness. Willingness to try something different until I found something that worked. Willingness to be open to new ideas. Willingness to admit that I didn't have all the answers. Willingness to accept responsibility for my actions. Willingness to admit when I was wrong. Willingness to feel my emotions instead of stuffing them down. Willingness to let go of the past. Willingness to feel joy and happiness. And most importantly, willingness to ask for and accept help. Has that process been easy? Not at all. Has the rewards been worth it? 100%. It is how I went from simply just being sober to a life where I am both sober and happy. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you're enjoying the podcast. This week, think of one person that you think will benefit from listening to this episode and send it to them. Be the person who plants a positive seed in someone else's life. You never know how much it could impact them. New episodes come out each Friday, so I look forward to connecting with you next week. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and keep living sober and happy.